Autopoietic Bloom is really about evoking a particular aesthetic experience. The goal was always phenomenological. In 2016, I was walking on a hill in Ithaca, New York, and I stopped to watch the sunset behind the hills to the west. As I watched, someone else stopped next to me and watched as well. And then another. And then another. Soon, there were maybe half a dozen people standing there watching the crimson sky, and when the horizon finally extinguished the light of the sun, we all dispersed in complete silence. I never spoke to any of the people there, I never learned their names, but somehow that unique aesthetic experience seemed to connect us all through space and time. So I didn't set out thinking, hey, I really want to make a musical improvisation engine, let me see if I can do that. But rather, I wanted to create something that would bind listeners implicitly and wordlessly by giving them a shared, non-repeatable aesthetic experience. I guess we should start with Amatria. Amatria is the name of a sculpture by the architecture firm Living Architecture Systems Group, led by Philip Beasley. It hangs above the 4th floor of Luddy Hall at Indiana University's Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering. LASG specializes in creating what they call sentient architecture, sculptures that respond dynamically and sustainably with their environments, transforming the ecologies of the structures we inhabit. Amatria is exactly that, featuring a sprawling canopy of delicate acrylic mesh that enreads the corridor and vials of electrolyte-filled glass that seem to explode outward from 2 central hemispheres. Amatria's aesthetic components seem to tell the story of abiogenesis, the emergence of life, during the very earliest stages of the universe. In addition, Amatria is capable of responding in various ways to her environment. She features infrared motion sensors and microphones that can detect sound and movement in her immediate surroundings, as well as various kinds of actuators, lights, speakers, vibrating plastic fronds that respond to those stimuli. In 2019, I began working at Luddy Hall, and when I saw Amatria for the first time, I said to myself, I need to do something with that. I need to talk to whoever is running that thing. Who do I have to email? Who do I need to talk to so that I can do something with that? Because that is really, really cool. Kati Börner is the Victor H. Ingve Professor of Engineering and Information Science at the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering, and leads the Cyber Infrastructure for Network Science Center, whose research focus involves science mapping. When I learned that they were the ones overseeing maintenance of the sculpture, I immediately sent them a million emails, and they were super nice and generous enough to connect me directly to the folks at Living Architecture Systems Group, from whom I was able to learn the nuts and bolts and ins and outs of all of Amatria's control systems. CNS also invited me to create a project featuring Amatria and present it at the sculpture's birthday celebration the following year. So, the gauntlet had been thrown, and the clock was ticking. So having been granted basically free reign to do whatever I wanted, I knew I had a bunch of options open to me. I knew I could create a fixed media piece for Amatria's 10 speakers, I could create a piece for live electronics and performer, but those would have ended up being one-off performances. And I really liked the idea of contributing something that could potentially become one of its permanent components. So I wanted to create a piece that would be native to the sculpture, as if it were an outgrowth of the sculpture. And so I took as a point of departure many of the questions that the Living Architecture Systems Group had been asking throughout their research. So, for example, can architecture integrate living functions? Could future buildings think or care? How do humans respond to these evolving interactions in a process of mutual adaptation? But then I started to take those questions in my own direction, asking things like, can living architecture help people to create social or parasocial relationships with their environments? What would be the nature of those relationships? Can living architecture help to mediate relationships among people? What role could sound play in that mediation? And how can living architecture connect people through a shared sonic environment? So those were the kinds of questions that were bouncing around my head. And I remember thinking back to that moment on that hillside in Ithaca, New York, and I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to create some kind of aesthetic experience that's going to implicitly connect listeners through time and space via a unique artistic event. So for that to happen, I realized I was going to need to create something that could make music that was different every time. And so in the spring of 2021, I embarked upon a massive undertaking to create from scratch a musical improvisation engine for Amatria. And 1 year later, after a whole bunch of hard work, a whole bunch of trial and error, a whole bunch of teaching myself the Bach library and parts of Max that I never even knew existed, the result was Autopoietic Bloom. Autopoietic Bloom is a mood-based gestural improvisation engine for multi-channel sentient architecture systems. Let's break that down. Amatria's multi-channel sound system supports 10 speakers, 3 in the large hemisphere, 1 in the small hemisphere, and 6 more splayed in an arc across the canopy inside of what are called sensor scouts, modules containing various sensors, actuators, lights, and a speaker. Thus, Autopoietic Bloom supports 10-channel output. Autopoietic Bloom's embedded ambisonic system allows these 10 outputs to be redistributed into any arbitrary number of speakers and configurations. But more on that in a bit. Next, Autopoietic Bloom is gestural. It takes a prototypical background gesture and uses that as the seed from which to generate musical structure organically. What we hear is a sort of one-dimensional projection of a multi-dimensional sound object that's undergoing constant transformation. Next, Autopoietic Bloom is mood-based. What does that mean? Well, in order for Autopoietic Bloom to mediate social relationships through sound, it needs to have an understanding of the overall mood of a community so it can create something that exists in dialogue with that community. What this means is, as the overall mood of its surrounding community changes, Autopoietic Bloom will actually improvise differently. Autopoietic Bloom responds empathically without collecting biometric data. It accomplishes this by accessing a kind of mood proxy, local weather data. At first glance, it's something that we all experience every day without really thinking too much about. But a closer look reveals that the weather can have a significant impact on the overall mood of a population. Thus, Autopoietic Bloom accesses local weather data in real time and then uses that data to select parameters for an improvisation. It then synthesizes those parameters in real time to create a unique piece of musical artistry. Okay, now that you know what Autopoietic Bloom is, let's talk a little bit about how it works. Here are the various components that make up Autopoietic Bloom. The improvisation engine itself consists of 4 sub-modules that we'll discuss in a little while: Donatoni, Syrinx, Quincy, and Zoe. There's an activation manager that controls when the software decides to improvise. There's a weather data retrieval system. There's a library of around 24 parametrically defined improvisational schemata. And finally, an Ambisonic Spatializer, which we'll talk more about a little bit later. Let's dive into the improvisation engine. The first module in the improvisation engine is Donatoni, a gesture-based note generator named after Franco Donatoni. Donatoni is what handles all of the rhythm and pitch data and heavily leverages the Bach library, a collection of Max objects and abstractions created and maintained by Andrea Agostini and Daniele Ghisi. The Bach library uses Lisp-like linked lists to represent musical information. These Lisp-like linked lists are essentially nested arrays. This hierarchical structure is an extremely convenient way of representing musical information. Since musical ideas are so often quite hierarchical, for example, you have notes, and then you have chords, and then you have measures, and you have voices, etc. All of these things lend themselves extremely well to hierarchical representation. To generate music, Donatoni receives an ur gesture, or a background gesture, upon which it's going to improvise. It reads this gesture, then applies any number of musical transformations, such as pitch rotation, transposition, rhythm diminution, truncation, inversion, rhythm scrambling, etc. That transformed gesture is then output by the module, and the process repeats iteratively. The value of each transformation function is specified parametrically on a high level by the improvisational scheme through which the software is reading. One can be very explicit when prescribing these transformation values. For example, you might say, take this melody and transpose it according to this pattern, or you can be very implicit with these definitions, and you can say something like, play chaotically here. This is because tied to each transformation function is a corresponding phrase generator. This is a program that essentially converts the subjective high-level specifications in the improvisational schemata into data values that the transformation functions can actually use. And they do this according to a subjective variable termed improvisational flux. Improvisational flux is essentially a measurement of musical chaos, musical entropy. When the value is low, the music doesn't change very often, and when it does change, it only does so by a small degree. When the value is high, the music changes very often, and when it changes, the changes are somewhat extreme. Donatoni is composed of 4 voices, each with its own background gesture, set of 11 transformation functions, and corresponding phrase generators. Transform gestures emerging from these voices are converted from Lisp-like linked lists to MIDI data. But crucially, there's no sound yet. For that to happen, the information must pass to the following module, Syrinx. Syrinx is a 4-bank multi-channel synthesizer. Syrinx is named for the organ in some birds that allows them to sing multiple notes at once. Here, the musical information from Donatoni is converted into sound. Each bank also supports up to 4 MIDI control signals as well as volume control. This allows Autopoietic Bloom to sculpt each timbre in real time as it's improvising. Next, Autopoietic Bloom needs to take these sounds and decide how they're going to be distributed across Amatria's 10 speakers. Enter Quincy, named after who else but composer and producer Quincy Jones. Quincy is Autopoietic Bloom's dynamic mixer. It uses similar algorithms as Donatoni to map Syrinx's 4 channels onto Amatria's 10 speakers. Through Quincy, Autopoietic Bloom can transform spatialization configurations in various ways during performance, giving it improvisational control over its spatial configurations as well. Taken all together, with Donatoni, Syrinx, and Quincy, we have something similar to very sophisticated wind chimes. It does something for a certain amount of time, and then it stops. But I wanted to be able to give its improvisations a sense of direction, a sense of drama, trajectory. It required an extra component that could transform isolated sound events into an organized musical work, that could turn a soundscape into narrative, recitative into aria. So what's required for this is something that can supply a sense of overarching musical structure and transformation over the course of a piece. The solution to this is the Zoe module. Zoe, named of course after the Greek word for life, imbues every song with a sense of artistic intent, giving each improvisation a sense of shape, development, metamorphosis, teleology, autopoiesis. Zoe is essentially a giant breakpoint interpolator that can interpolate parameters over an arbitrary number of points in time over the course of a composition. It supports interpolation of all 235 of Autopoietic Bloom's parameters. Thus, each improvisational scheme can be thought of as a giant n-dimensional sound sculpture where n is 235. Thus, the music that is improvised can have beginnings, middles, ends, climaxes, nadirs, accelerandi, diminuendi, etc. These 4 modules together, Donatoni, the gesture-based note generator, Syrinx, the multi-channel synthesizer, Quincy, the dynamic mixer, and Zoe, the interpolation engine, form the core of Autopoietic Bloom's improvisation engine. Before we get into the demonstration, there are 2 more components that I want to talk about that aren't part of the improvisation engine, but are nonetheless extremely important. The first is the Ambisonic Spatializer, and the second is Mood Oracle, the visualization system. Normally, the 10-channel sound coming out of Quincy is sort of sent one-to-one to all of Amatria's 10 speakers. But the fact that the speaker arrangement is so specific and irregular means that the sonic experience can only really occur in person in a site-specific way. This isn't necessarily inherently negative, but I wanted people to be able to experience Autopoietic Bloom away from the sculpture, especially for demonstration purposes. So what I did was I measured the position of each speaker with respect to where a listener would be standing, and use that information to create a virtual sound space in SPAT5. When it's in its normal 10-channel mode, the sounds just go directly from Quincy out to each speaker. But when it's in ambisonic mode, the sound goes to 10 virtual sound sources inside of this simulated space. You can then project that space onto any number of speakers in any number of arrangements, 8-channel, 16-channel, 4-channel, 10-channel, stereo, binaural, etc. The inclusion of the Ambisonic Spatializer has allowed me to share Autopoietic Bloom both with members of the IU community virtually, as well as people outside of the IU community around the world. For example, in 2022, Autopoietic Bloom was installed for 1 week at the 2022 NEAF North Summer Festival in Knoxville, Tennessee, using a 4-channel projection setup. At the festival, musicians even improvised along with the sculpture during a concert. The piece has also been demonstrated at various talks, lectures, etc., using the binaural or stereo projections. To further aid people in experiencing the work away from the physical sculpture, I created Mood Oracle. Mood Oracle is a simple visualization system for Autopoietic Bloom. Each voice is color-coded, and each speaker lights up with the corresponding color of the voice that's playing. There's also a visual reference for where you, the listener, would be standing in this virtual sound space. Make no mistake, Autopoietic Bloom sounds incredible in person. Each speaker is handmade, and so each one has its own subtle frequency response that's different from all the others, and it gives it a really, really special timbre that you just can't get from the Ambisonic Spatializer. But that said, the Ambisonic Spatializer is extremely useful and has been really, really great. The community impact of Autopoietic Bloom has been immensely fulfilling. Immensely fulfilling. One day when I was showing the work to one of my friends, as the piece started playing, people started poking their heads out of the focus rooms and the meeting rooms that are around the 4th floor of Letty Hall. And after a few minutes, they all stood in a circle around the sculpture to listen to it play. And when it was done playing, everyone silently dispersed. That was exactly the experience I wanted people to have. That was exactly the experience I wanted people to have. So seeing that happen was insanely fulfilling. It was like you had this phenomenological goal, and there it is. You did it. Congrats. It was extremely fulfilling, extremely moving, and that kind of thing continues to happen to this day, and it's really wonderful. Thank you for listening to my very detailed explanation of this work. I'm now going to play a short demonstration for you. This improvisational scheme corresponds to the Rainfall weather pattern, and I've chosen this one because it very, very transparently illustrates the kinds of musical processes, computational processes, algorithmic processes, improvisational processes that are at work behind the scenes. So you'll hear a repeating motif in this very sort of kalimba-like voice, and then that, after a while, begins to be transformed with greater and greater improvisational flux. So, cheers.